At 3:03 a.m. on August 8, 1963, a Royal Mail train bound for London screeches to a halt in the darkness of the Buckinghamshire countryside. Inside, a postal worker sorting through deliveries assumes it's a routine stop, but when he opens his compartment door, he finds himself looking at empty rails. The rest of the train is gone. Half a mile down the track, 15 masked men are already at work, unloading over £2.5 million in cash from the severed carriage. For 120 years, the Royal Mail had moved massive sums of money across the UK without a single mishap or a lost penny. To understand how this seemingly invincible institution was brought to its knees, we have to look at the man behind the stop, a thief whose career had been building toward a job of this magnitude. Bruce Reynolds grew up without a sense of home. His mother died when he was 4, and by 1939, he was one of thousands of children evacuated from London, moving between host families while his father struggled with chronic unemployment. By 14, Reynolds was on his own, drifting through a series of mundane jobs. He worked as a messenger boy, a clerk, and a lab assistant, but found the repetitive nature of accounting and clerical work unbearable. He found his lane at 17 while working for a bicycle shop. A few of his teammates were active shoplifters, and Reynolds discovered he was naturally suited for the work. Within months, he was one of the most effective young thieves in London. He was eventually arrested and sent to prison, but he viewed his time there as an education. Reynolds described it as moving from prep school to university, where he networked with veteran safecrackers and traded techniques for high-end robberies. By 1962, he was leading his own crew. They hit a security van at Heathrow Airport, escaping with £62,000, the equivalent of nearly $2 million today. The crew began calling him Napoleon because of how methodically he planned every move. Reynolds lived the part. He wore tailored suits, read philosophy, and drove an Aston Martin, all while searching for the opportunity to execute a flawless crime. By 1963, Reynolds had become a highly specialized criminal instrument. He just needed to find a target with a critical vulnerability. An informant known as the Ulsterman provided the lead, a regularly scheduled Royal Mail train passing from Glasgow to London. Because of a bank holiday on August 5th, the train scheduled for August 8th would be carrying a massive backlog of cash shipments from the long weekend. Instead of the usual few £100,000, the payload was estimated at $2 million. The money was held in a specific carriage, the high-value package coach. These cars were designed to transport bonds and massive sums of currency. The post office had recommended that all of these coaches be outfitted with alarms and reinforced bars, but the rollout was slow and expensive. By August, only 3 such coaches were in service, and none of them were scheduled for the August 8th run. A 120-year-old bureaucracy's inability to upgrade its equipment had left a multi-million-pound shipment completely unprotected. Reynolds spent months preparing. He recruited 15 men, including specialists like a retired train driver, an ex-pilot, and a professional getaway driver. To serve as a safe house, the gang purchased Leatherslade Farm, a remote property in Buckinghamshire that offered a 360-degree view of the surrounding countryside. At midnight on August 8th, the crew left the farm in an army truck and 2 Land Rovers covered in military paint, moving through the backroads toward the tracks. One group was tasked with cutting the telephone lines at a secluded bridge, while the other team moved a kilometer up the track to a signal gantry to physically halt the train. With a strictly defined role for every man and a schedule planned down to the minute, Reynolds had removed the unpredictability typical of a standard robbery. At 3:03 a.m., the Royal Mail train approached the gantry at Sears Crossing. To stop the train, the gang relied on the mechanical simplicity of the railway signals. As it approached, the men covered the green light with a leather glove and simultaneously hot-wired the red stop signal with a portable battery, forcing a false warning. The driver hit the brakes. When his assistant tried to use the emergency trackside phone, he found a line was already dead. With a leather glove and a portable battery, Reynolds had neutralized the train's only line of communication and defense. While the gang successfully stopped the train, Walking away with £2 million would trigger the largest and most aggressive manhunt in British history. The gang had strict rules going into this heist. Rule number 1, no violence. But the moment the train driver tried to fight back, that rule went out the window. One of the robbers struck him over the head with an iron club, leaving him bleeding on the floor. Things weren't going any smoother in the High Valley package car. The robbers broke in using a pickaxe, only to find 4 postal workers who were entirely willing to throw punches. After a brief physical struggle, the gang pinned the crew to the floor, tied them up, and finally secured the prize. Now they needed to move the train half a mile down the track to safely unload the cash. They brought their own replacement driver for exactly this task. But there was a glaring oversight in their blueprints. Their guy was retired. He only knew how to operate older air brake systems, and he was staring at a set of modern vacuum-powered controls he had never seen before. The gang's months of meticulous planning hit a dead end because of a single human limitation. To get the train to the drop point, they had to drag the bleeding, half-conscious driver back to the controls and force him to drive his own captured locomotive. When the train dragged its way to Bridego Bridge, the extraction went off like clockwork. The gang formed a human chain, passing heavy sacks of cash down the embankment into a waiting army truck in near total darkness. In a matter of minutes, they loaded exactly 120 mailbags. This chart shows how massive that haul actually was. Back at their hideout, they counted a grand total of just under £2.6 million. Adjusted for inflation today, you are looking at a payday of over $96 million. They retreated to a secluded property called Leatherslade Farm. They sat down, divided the cash perfectly into equal shares of roughly £150,000 per man, and patted themselves on the back. As far as they knew, they had just executed a flawless surgical extraction. But taking the money is always the easiest part of a job. The real test is the logistics of the escape. And in less than 24 hours, the weight of keeping that cash hidden would start to crush them. By the time the sun came up, the entire country was looking for them. The newspapers were already calling it the Great Train Robbery, and the police quickly slapped a massive £260,000 bounty on their heads for any information leading to an arrest. Their plan was to wait out the heat at Leatherslade. They had purchased the property entirely in cash, overpaying simply to ensure no questions were asked. Sitting in the middle of vast open fields, it was supposed to be the perfect ghost property to lay low. Then the noon broadcast hit the radio. The BBC reported that the gang used army vehicles during the theft. Panic set in. One of the men rushed out to repaint their stolen military truck yellow, but he ran out of paint halfway through, leaving a glaring, half-yellow, half-green beacon sitting right in their driveway. Now they were genuinely trapped. While one guy pedaled a bicycle to the nearest town to call for new getaway cars, the rest of the gang sat inside. To pass the time, they drank beers and played a game of Monopoly, using actual stolen cash for the bank. This is where their strategy completely inverted. The extreme isolation of Leatherslade didn't protect them. It turned the house into a pressure cooker. Trapped inside with nothing to do, the men grew restless and incredibly careless. The next morning, the radio delivered a fatal blow. A postal worker from the train testified to investigators about a specific instruction the gang gave as they left. They had explicitly ordered the crew not to call the police for exactly 30 minutes. This map shows how police weaponized that detail. Investigators calculated how far heavy trucks could travel in half an hour. They drew a boundary, focusing the manhunt within a 30-mile radius. The math worked perfectly. Leatherslade Farm sat exactly 27 miles away. Combined with a tip from a local farmer who had noticed the strange cash purchase of the property, the police knew exactly where to look. By the time they arrived, the gang had fled, but the physical evidence was still sitting there. Taking charge of that evidence was Tommy Butler. He led the Flying Squad, an elite London unit strictly dedicated to robberies. Butler was 54, obsessive, and worked 7 days a week without a social life. If there was one man built purely to dismantle this gang, it was him. Butler's team walked into a forensic gold mine. The gang thought they had wiped the farmhouse clean, but the Flying Squad pulled 311 pristine fingerprints from the property. They found them on tabletops, on a ketchup bottle, and across the Monopoly board. In a single afternoon, the hunt went from a sprawling national mystery to an inevitable mathematical certainty. The gang's failure to properly sanitize their own hideout gave Butler a clean, undeniable list of targets. The arrests triggered like dominoes, all stemming from basic, sloppy mistakes. One robber tried paying 3 months of rent up front using thick stacks of 10-pound notes. The police caught another man because his lawyer casually mentioned staying at a specific hotel in Berlin, matching a receipt found in the trash at the farm. By early 1964, the flying squad had captured 10 of the 16 gang members. Buried under more than 600 pieces of evidence, the men were swept through the courts, convicted, and hit with massive prison sentences of up to 30 years. But Tommy Butler still had one target left. He was hunting Bruce Reynolds, the self-styled Napoleon of the operation. Reynolds had orchestrated the entire job, and now he was watching his criminal empire collapse from the shadows. Knowing Butler was closing in, Reynolds deployed a series of desperate evasion tactics. He sent his infant son away, parked a decoy car at the airport to trick investigators into thinking he'd left the country, and rented an apartment right in the middle of London. He was attempting to hide in plain sight. The gang managed to stop a train in the dead of night and pull off a multi-million-dollar extraction. But brilliant physical execution means absolutely nothing if the escape logistics fall apart. A flawless heist was dismantled by a Monopoly board and a ketchup bottle, leaving the mastermind out in the cold, clutching a fortune he couldn't spend, and eternally looking over his shoulder. Within days of the robbery, investigators tracked the gang to their hideout at Leatherslade Farm. They walked into a treasure trove of physical evidence left behind in the rush to escape. The British justice system used those fingerprints and discarded items to hand down 30-year prison sentences to the captured crew members. Curious, but the authorities still had a massive problem. The bulk of the stolen millions was nowhere to be found, and several key members of the gang had thingily vanished into thin air. 3 of those men, Bruce Reynolds, Charlie Wilson, and Ronnie Biggs, would spend the next 4 decades forging entirely different paths. Their escapes would involve plastic surgery, international smuggling, and murder. Pulling off the Great Train robbery took a few hours of coordination. Surviving the 40-year getaway would require a level of endurance few of the gang possessed. Bruce Reynolds was the mastermind behind the entire operation. After securing his cut, he fled to Mexico to live out a lavish, high-society lifestyle among the global elite. But staying out of reach is incredibly expensive. Between the fancy cars, luxury hotels, and lavish dinners, Reynolds burned through the equivalent of £3.6 million in just 5 years. After a failed attempt to recruit other fugitives in Canada and France, his money completely dried up. By 1968, he made the only move he had left, returning to London, the very city where he was the most wanted man. The man who prided himself on planning every detail was caught completely broke in his bedroom by Tommy Butler, the lead detective on the case. The meticulous planning that defined Reynolds' career couldn't account for the daily financial drain of life on the run, leaving him bankrupt and back in a London jail cell. Meanwhile, Charlie Wilson, known as the Silent Man, was locked away inside HM Prison Wandsworth. He was subjected to 15-minute guard checks and forced to sleep without clothes to prevent any attempt at escape. In the dead of night, 3 masked accomplices scaled Wandsworth's 20-foot exterior wall with a heavy rope ladder, gagged a guard, and pulled Wilson out of his cell. With a face altered by plastic surgery, Wilson vanished into Canada to live as a wealthy gentleman farmer. He blended in for years, right up until the authorities intercepted a single Christmas letter he sent to a relative in the UK. Wilson was recaptured, served a decade behind bars, and was paroled in 1978. He immediately returned to the underworld as a high-level figure in international drug trafficking and fraud. In 1990, a young man knocked on his front door, claiming to have a message from London. After a 5-minute chat, the visitor shot the 57-year-old multiple times in the head and disappeared. Wilson's death remains an unsolved mystery of the criminal underworld, a violent conclusion for a man who spent his final years laundering millions for the very syndicates that likely ordered his hit. Ronnie Biggs was a petty thief who botched his only job of securing a getaway train driver, ultimately getting caught because he left a fingerprint on a Monopoly board and a ketchup bottle. After serving just 15 months, his wife financed an elaborate prison break. Biggs went on the run, burning through his cut on plastic surgery and bribes as he moved his family from Paris to Australia. With the authorities closing in, Biggs boarded a boat to South America. He eventually settled in Brazil, a country with no UK extradition treaty, effectively rendering him immune to British law. His time in exile took an absurd turn when a team of ex-soldiers kidnapped Biggs from a restaurant, drugged him, and stuffed him onto a boat in a duffel bag labeled Live Anaconda. When Brazil demanded his return, Biggs leaned into the spectacle. He charged tourists £50 to meet him at backyard barbecues and recorded a song with the Sex Pistols. Biggs survived not through criminal genius, but by weaponizing his own public notoriety to fund a life in the sun. After decades on the run, a series of strokes left an elderly Biggs half-paralyzed. He ultimately sold his final surrender to a British tabloid for £20,000 just to return home and access public health care. He served several more years before being released on compassionate grounds. In 2013, both Ronnie Biggs and Bruce Reynolds died, closing the book on the living perpetrators of the robbery. This chart shows the total value of the cash taken in the Great Train Robbery, an enormous £2.6 million in 1963 currency. And yet, looking at the fraction actually recovered by authorities, you see a massive void. Only £343,000 was ever found. The vast majority of the cash disappeared into the high cost of a fugitive life. To survive, the gang eventually replaced that missing loot with media revenue, cashing in on autobiographies and movie rights. The perpetrators of the Great Train Robbery lost their stolen fortune and decades of their freedom. However, they successfully used the media to immortalize themselves as legends of British crime.